Chinese Canadians to purchase a home outside of Chinatown, as well as a cottage in Northern Ontario in 1957. So what I'm going to do now is just pause, because Marilyn might want to add a few memories from about her parents. And I don't think I can answer that question about why my mother called your mother Queen Elizabeth as opposed to Elizabeth. I think it had a lot to do with that your mother was like the Queen of Chinatown. I think that's the reason for that title.
Well, I think that probably, because my dad was quite prominent, and my mother was, considered the Queen. And of course, Elizabeth was a very popular name for the royalty of the British, we were at that time part of the British Commonwealth. They colony for the longest time, then it became a part of the Commonwealth. So I think it was sort of an inside joke with your mom and my mom. I just said there weren't many Chinese women, so Chinese families, we were considered like a Chinatown family because there were not too many young children. So I think your mom and my mom, having so many children, they were sort of like the pets of Chinatown. And I remember going to our Chinese bank, we always received these little home bao with the Chinese money in the little red envelopes. Remember that, Arlene?
Yep.
Yeah. And New Year's, we always came back with lots of little red envelopes, and so that we were treated very well as children. And I remember going to many of my father's speeches at the Hagerman Hall, where the Chinese Guapitong had their meetings, and in those days we did with babysitters, so we always went along with our parents to Peking Opera, to the Chinese meetings, and and hearing a lot of speeches. I remember a lot of speeches, a lot of long dinners, a lot of good food. I'm sure you do too, because your mom had a very successful business. She had a very successful restaurant. We had many fine dinners there with the Chinese community. Those are all the memories. And, so we've known each other's family for a long time. And when eventually my mom and your mom settled at the same apartment building on St. Patrick, and that was kind of a nice ending, It started to get their being together near the end of their lives. That was very, they were good times. A lot of Chinese picnics from the churches. The Wong Association had picnics. Every association had picnics, and we would always go to each other's picnics, and that's how we got to be really close and got to meet everybody in Chinatown. And in those days, you knew everybody in Chinatown. Chinatown was very small. Now, it's huge. I don't think I can recognize anybody on the streets anymore. But it's good. Those are good memories.
Okay, those are really good memories. Thank you, Marilyn, for sharing those. I just do have some other photos I want to show you. Oops. There's a picture of the Kuomintang building. So I don't remember this building at all, and it was torn down during the when they tore. I'll talk about that later about the what they tore down in Chinatown. And I do have some pictures. I was just going to say during the exclusionary period, which is the time period your parents came in, and I asked your brother Nelson, I said, how is it that your parents were able to come into Canada during that exclusionary period? Because no Chinese were allowed to come in. There were 4 exempt classes, and one of them was students. So I really think that that's how they came in, because they're being students.
My mother couldn't go to the States because it was very exclusionary, but she was allowed to go to Canada. And so that's why my dad, after he graduated, went to Toronto to get married, because my mother could not go down to the States. And they came in as students. My mother in China went to a Christian missionary school, and that's probably how she got in, because it was an American-run missionary school, and that's probably how she got in as a student.
Okay. Yeah, so during that time, again, is the exclusionary period when no Chinese, except for students, except for diplomats, and there were a couple of other categories. But the male-female population at the time was 10 to 1, and I mentioned earlier that there were so few Chinese families at that time. And my father he'd come from China when he was 9 years old, and my mother, who was born in British Columbia, they met. There was a matchmaker that paired the two of them up. And so I always said to my father, I said, "You know how lucky you were that you found Mom, and that because there were so few women, and so you're so lucky that you got one of the few women around to marry up." And his response, and with his sense of humor, he said, "Well, there wasn't much choice back then." So he looks at it a little differently.
Well, my parents knew each other back in China. So mother came over because her father and mother told her, if you really care for W.C. Wong, you better go over there and marry him, because when he comes back to China, he'll have to pick all the women in China. Because overseas parties were considered very eligible. So I guess she decided to go over to Toronto, make sure they got married. And that's how she happened to come over and do it first, but they knew each other in China.
Right. Otherwise, he would have been slim pickings over in Canada. Some quick shots of Chinatown in 1934. We have our old streetcar there, and this is a traffic jam because it looks like the truck has lost its rear wheel and the police is directing traffic. So even in 1934 they had traffic jams, believe it or not. Another picture of Chinatown in 1937. This would be on Elizabeth Street, which doesn't mean anything to you, but it's significant in Toronto because that's where the Chinatown was. And this is another shot in 1937. And this is a picture of W.C. Wong sitting in his office. And because he was so educated, he was responsible for, in many ways, being the spokesperson for the Chinese community. And Marilyn mentioned that back then, everybody knew everybody because it was such a small community. And I remember when I was growing up that people would say, "Who's your father?" or "Who's your mother?" And then they would say, oh, "Okay, I know your mother, I know your father." So we always had to be in our best behavior because otherwise they would report back to our parents. So this is a picture of Mr. Wong, and he's writing a telegram, and that was the important way of communicating information that was coming from China and sending it across Canada. And also he had a very big role in writing on behalf of the Chinese community in English to the Canadian government, concerns that were held by the Chinese community. Some very important, like lots of meetings that he would have attended. And just in this one shot, again from the Wong family album, so many people of those men in that group were very important leaders in the community. And the man in the bottom right-hand corner there at the very front is Doc Yip, and he was the first Chinese Canadian to become a lawyer. So it just shows again how involved Mr. Wong was in the community. He was also a teacher. This is a picture of him teaching a Chinese school class. And I did ask my husband to translate what was on the board because I don't read Chinese, and said it was a philosophy class. So very serious stuff that they taught in Chinese school.
Oh, I never had that class.
Oh, you didn't have that class.
I think he gave up teaching Chinese to his own children, I'll tell you right now.
Well, he looks pretty serious here in this photo, and everybody seems to be really paying attention. This is, again, during that whole exclusionary period, how active the Chinese were in terms of raising funds for the war in China against the Japanese. And also later on during World War II, the Chinese community was very involved in fundraising. And this is a picture of, it's very hard for you to see because it's in a smaller version, but you can see at the back of the float there's somebody that has this incredible headpiece on. And that's Mrs. Wong there dressed up as a woman warrior. And unfortunately you can't see the two little kids there too well, but one of the kids there looks like about age 8 or 9 is Nelson Wong, and Marilyn is the little one in between Nelson and his mom. So I think you look about 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah, I have a photograph of her. Yeah, Nelson's wearing a cowboy hat.
Yeah, Nelson's wearing a cowboy hat.